Minutes. We will start in a few minutes. Okay, we can start now. So, am I audible?
I can hear you.
Yeah. So, before going to the talk, I would like to give a brief introduction about today's program and our speaker. So, today we gathered here as part of the Myrmecarnival program. Myrmecarnival is an outreach program aimed at familiarizing the common ants and the importance of ants to the general public. So, we will also showcase the unique capabilities and life of ants using notes, photographs, and interactive sessions via the official media and Instagram pages of Vetri. So today we have our first invited talk, Planet of the Ants. Planet of the Ants is a general talk about ants by Dr. Andrea Leckie. Dr. Leckie is an associate professor and graduate coordinator at the Entomology and Nematology Department, University of Florida. She's an evolutionary biologist and biodiversity scientist with a focus on insects, especially the evolution of ants. Her research program focuses on two main themes: insect evolution and biodiversity, science communication with non-scientific audiences. So research in the Leckie lab addresses fundamental questions about evolutionary relationships among different ant lineages and the timing of dispersal and diversification that has led to the distribution patterns we see today. Dr. Leckie uses citizen science as a tool to involve the public in research about native and invasive insects and to teach about science in general. So it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Leckie for the talk. Welcome, Dr. Leckie.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So one more thing, if any attendees have any doubt or clarifications, you can just raise your hands. Our system engineer Gautam will allow you to promote you to the panelist, or either you can type in the Q&A box. Okay, Dr. Leckie, you can start now.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me to be here today. This is a wonderful event. I am so delighted that there's this whole event dedicated to promotion of ants and ant education, because that is at the heart of what I do. And so I will start just explaining this topic, the title of my talk today, which is Planet of the Ants. And I think my screen sharing is paused. Is there a way to share my screen so that the participants can see my my screen?
Your screen is already shared.
Yeah, it's already shared.
It is? Okay, I have a message here that says screen sharing is paused.
You can just stop sharing it and reshare it. Okay.
Stop sharing and reshare? Okay. So you don't do, what do you see me right now or do you see the slide?
Both.
Both. Oh, okay. Well, if you see both, then that's great. So I wanted to explain this title, The Planet of the Ants, because for those of us who study ants and spend a lot of our time working with ants, it really has shaped the way we view the planet. It's an entire world that is covered with just thousands and thousands of species of ants, each of which has its own unique ecology and capability and evolutionary history. A fascinating world that we're really only scratching the surface of as we study each individual lineage. So in this talk today, I wanted to give you a brief explanation of a little bit of why I study ants, but mostly to talk broadly about what makes ants so incredibly powerful and important on our planet, and also how they affect all the other organisms that interact with them, including us. So let me go ahead and see if I can get my screen sharing to start up again. And move forward with my talk. So in that very nice introduction, Aswash mentioned that I am at the University of Florida. I'm in the department, the entomology and nematology department, and I have what I would consider the best job in the world because I get to teach not just about ants, but about entomology broadly and a number of other topics to a very large entomology department. We may be the largest entomology department in the world, certainly in the United States. And my research on ant systematics and also in science education gives me a chance to delve into topics that are of great interest to me. And since you're attending this today, possibly to you as well. So in this talk, my goal is to introduce you to your neighbors. Now, you may not know them individually. You may not know how many species of ants actually live very close to you and around you and how they affect you. But let me give you a brief introduction so that you can have some appreciation for those little critters that we do share the planet with. So why is it important to understand ants? And if you already are passionate about ants, then why is it important to help other people understand what ants do and why we care so much about them? One of the reasons, and increasingly one of the reasons that I spend a lot of time talking to people about ants, not just people who love ants, but people who dislike ants, is because ants are increasingly important invasive species. Here are just a handful. These 5 species are considered amongst some of the world's most important and negatively impactful invasive species. They're costly, they can be painful, and they affect things like crops. Most people will interact more with these negative, with ant species that have negative consequences for humans. In fact, they will think of ants generally as pests. And one of the problems with these pest species, of course, is that their impact on the natural systems in which they occur can have a terrible impact on our native species of ants. So whereas I started out in my career attempting to be a biodiversity science and understand the world of global ant richness, a big part of my work these days is thinking about how do we protect the global ant richness that's out there and really global biodiversity, not just by studying individual species, but also understanding the impacts of things like invasive species. So let's talk a little bit about richness. It's one of these remarkable facts that today we have enough data on ant species diversity around the world that something like this ant map, and this is antmaps.org, can put together a beautiful map like this, looking at political boundaries and accumulating enough information about the species richness across the globe to show us where hotspots of ant diversity are. It also does an amazing job of showing us areas where we may not have that much information about ants. You'll see some surprisingly light spots on the map. Maybe look at the region in which you work or where you live, and you can ask, does that look like it really reflects the true diversity of ants in your region? In many places, especially in some tropical places that have been understudied, there's a lot yet to discover. So right now we have about 13,000 named species of ants, and we think that there are probably about double that number truly in the world today. So ant taxonomists or ant biodiversity scientists in training, you have your work cut out for you. There's still quite a lot of diversity that remains undescribed. As I mentioned, I started out my career really interested in understanding biodiversity. I was fortunate enough to get my start working with a Smithsonian entomologist. This was Terry Irwin. You may have read about him in your biology textbooks. He was one of the first people to really put some numbers out there and estimate that there may be as many as 30 million species of insects in the world. Now, part of the work that he did was fogging trees in the South American rainforest, catching the insects that fell down, and then having teams of students, I was one of them, sort through the insects and then actually do the counting. How much diversity do we have? All those groups were farmed out to different taxonomists and specialists. And so that's where some of these numbers came from. But it really introduced me to the idea of studying biodiversity. The idea that you need specialists, but you also need field folks who can go out, design projects, especially long-term projects, large-scale projects, and capture as much of that diversity as possible so that then the specimens can be brought to the specialists. And then later on, bring all those data back so that you can actually make some assessments about where diversity is high or low, or how diversity changes over space and time. Well, that start led me to a career in which I've had an opportunity to travel to a lot of places around the world. It's been a delight, and it's been really fascinating working in places where diversity has been understudied. I'll just mention one place that I had the opportunity to go with a conservation organization, and that was Papua New Guinea. And we had a chance to go to some fairly remote areas, do some sampling. You might know this type of sampling. These Winkler bags are passive extraction bags, somewhat like doing a Berlese funnel, but in a place where you don't have access to electricity. Leaf litter sampling is really what I focused on for a lot of the work that I did. And in many of the places where I worked, there's a huge amount of undersampling in the sense that more than 50% of what we collected were species that were undescribed by science. Now, this is changing as more and more people are getting into our field, but increasingly as I travel and as I do biodiversity work, I notice that invasive species, global ants that we would call them globetrotters, global tramp ants, are becoming increasingly a threat to native species diversity and threatening ecosystems. So in some ways, it feels like a race against time to really understand some of these places that are desperately in need of documentation and conservation before they get so impacted by global change. Well, let me switch gears a little bit and talk about where I live now, which is Florida. And Florida has a wonderful ant richness, nearly 200 species, which may not sound like much after being in places like Ecuador or Papua New Guinea, but it's a really fascinating mix because in addition to those native species, we have a huge number of introduced species. Possibly after Hawaii, it might be one of the places that has the highest rate of new species introductions. They say that there's a new species introduced once a month in Florida. Now, whether that gets established or not, it still is really a shocking number, and it has huge impacts on our local diversity. But it does mean that there are really wonderful opportunities to study some of these interactions between native and non-native species. I like to think about the world as having this global ant diversity, a nice big wheel like an orange slice. And if you think about Florida, it's just a much smaller slice of the world's ant pie. Now, if you think about how many global ant invaders we have in the world, it's not that many. It's less than 1%. But if you look at Florida, it's nearly 25%. Now, is this what's coming to the rest of the world? Perhaps, if we take a pessimistic view. But right now, I want to concentrate on the rest of the orange, the ones that are not necessarily invaders, but do fascinating, wonderful, and interesting things. There's a lot amongst them that we really want to study and understand before they're gone. So let me just start out by showing you that people interact with ants all the time, but often don't even notice them. They're right underfoot. And we often don't have the chance to think about what really makes an ant an ant. So I'm going to go through some of the details of what make an ant an ant. You probably know many of these things. And one of the things I'd like to state right off the bat is that almost all of my photos that I'm showing here are from Alex Wild. It has a wonderful website full of amazing photos. And then some of them are from AntWeb, another amazing website that collects just fascinating, massive information. So all ants are eusocial, and that means that they have overlapping generations in their nest. They cooperate in terms of raising their brood. They also have reproductive division of labor. You remember this from biology class, I'm sure, that the workers are sterile, and that reproductive division of labor means that the queen does the reproduction and the workers do not. Generally, of course, there are always exceptions. Now, in some cases, you get this wonderful caste differentiation where we have minors and majors, or you might call those majors soldiers. In some cases, you have multiple levels of different sizes. So you get super majors, and those become just fascinating to study because there's some wonderful developmental biology behind how that actually happens. How do you get different morphologies within the same species? Remember, it's all the same genome within those individuals, amongst those individuals. So of course we know that sociality isn't just limited to ants, it's in termites, it's in bees and wasps and a couple of other taxa out there. Now, when we talk about queens, now this is not like the queen who gets to rule over the entire kingdom. Really, we have to think about this reproductive division of labor, which puts the queen in the position of having reproductive rights, whereas the others do not. So the reproduction is the realm of the queen. And although she does exert a certain amount of control over the colony through, to some degree, what we might call hormonal control or chemical control, it's really a matter of individuals within the colony responding to the presence of the queen and the state of the queen, the state of the colony. As we'll see, this whole colony structure is very much a chemical unit. There's lots of chemical communication going on. And this division of labor, different tasks, task differentiation, is what makes ants so effective in functioning as a superorganism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some aspects of living in a colony that are especially interesting in ants. Now, we often see ants going out and collecting food. It's one of the ways that we interact with them because when they're foraging, they're often on the surface and quite visible. But if we focus a little bit on feeding, there are some lesser known facts about ants that are quite important to remember. By and large, adult ants really can only ingest liquids. It's part of the structure of their gut. They have some control mechanisms in there that really only let very tiny particles or just simply liquids pass through. So why are there all these ants out there collecting things like crickets or cockroaches or cookie crumbs or whatever crumbs we might leave on the ground? Well, those solid foods are actually fed to the larvae. And when it comes to the adults, they really do need to have liquid food, such as honeydew that they might collect from aphids, or other liquids. Maybe they can consume the liquids that they, from a dead insect, for example, if it's fresh. But this really paints a slightly different picture of ant interactions with the world that we interact with. We don't often think of them as caretakers of their babies. There are some incredible stories about ants that actually feed food to their larvae and then drink the hemolymph from their own larvae by piercing their cuticle. Now, that's an amazing kind of strange interaction if you think about what that means in terms of the need for having larvae in order to feed the adults. It seems like a precarious system, but these ants, often called Dracula ants, seem to have persisted for quite a long time doing this. So ants eat all sorts of things. They're predators, they're scavengers, there are herbivores. So these granivores, some of them have huge heads with massive muscles, so they can actually grind the grains that they're harvesting from the grasses. There are fungus farmers and insect herders, and I'd like to show you a few of them. So for example, we have these ants that milk honeydew from aphids. You've heard these stories, I'm sure, but it's wonderful to see up close how these interactions play out. There are also ants that focus on plants. And one of the things that ants do in response to plants is that, and I should say it the other way around, plants do in response to ants, is there are certain plants that actually have their seeds distributed by ants, and they attract the ants to them by having specialized, what we might call a fruit, an elaiosome, fleshy covering over the seed that has attractive chemicals that draw ants in, really attract them to them, and they just can't resist this fleshy fruit. I always think of these as a little bit like mangoes. It's hard to resist a ripe mango. You take it with you, you eat it, you get rid of the seed. And ants do this for a huge number of plants, especially in places that are often fire-driven systems. Ants can be hugely important in terms of seed dispersal for understory plants in some of these environments. And of course, we know about these wonderful leafcutter ants in the neotropics, where the ants are very important above ground in terms of their impact on plants because they do so much leaf cutting. But it's not actually the leaves that they're eating, of course. They're using the leaves as a substrate in order to grow their food, which is actually a fungus. And so this ability to be cultivators, mushroom growers, and select the substrate that they're growing on is one of the most remarkable things we see in ants. Now, here's a fun view of that species of ant from the human perspective. Should you be walking across this landscape, you might find this big mound of soil. This has been excavated while the colony structure has been excavated from underground. It looks big, doesn't it? Well, it is actually the biggest social organism, or at least the biggest colony size for a non-unicolonial ant. This has a single queen. This is one giant colony. And this species, this is an Atta species in Paraguay, is the largest single colony species that we know of. Now, a BBC crew several years ago tried to excavate an entire colony. They filled the tunnels with concrete and they tried to shore up structures. This is what you're looking at now, so that they could see actually the size and the structure within the colony. Now, those little specks you see in there, the little blue and white specks, those are people who are inside that site. So these enormous colonies are big enough that you can actually see them from a satellite view of Earth. So Atta vollenweteri, this is the largest colony size of an ant that we know of. Really hugely impactful when you think about how much they must affect the landscape, underground as well as above ground where they live. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about some chemical communication in ants. Now, of course, you know that ants have trail pheromones. When they go off and find some wonderful food item and they come rushing back to the colony to let them know where it is, they lay down some chemicals, and that chemical trail then gets reinforced by those ants that have been recruited to that site. So the more ants that go along the trail, laying down chemical pheromones, the more of an urgent message this is that this is the right way to go. If the food source is depleted, then the ants come back, they don't lay down that trail pheromone, and eventually it dissipates over time. And so that's a very simple way in which recruitment occurs, mediated by chemical communication. There's also trophallaxis. So ants interact with one another quite a lot. When you see ants meet on a trail, you see them do what looks like they antenate one another, basically touching one another with their antennae on their heads and their bodies. But trophallaxis is when they actually exchange fluids. And this can be simply an exchange of perhaps sugar water, some sort of nectar, transferring the nutrition, but it also is a transfer of information via chemicals. Alarm pheromone is something that we see all the time. Whenever we disturb a nest, we can see ants just getting very upset, and that alarm spreads quickly through alarm pheromone. So ants that have a lot to defend often have a very quick response in releasing that alarm pheromone, alerting their nest mates that something needs to be done because there might be some sort of threat nearby. Now, I mentioned before that the queen has some control over what goes on in the colony by her queen pheromone. And this is a very interesting topic of study because the presence of the queen, simply her being there, releasing queen pheromone, has somewhat of an organizing effect on the colony. And so the reverse is true. If the queen is lost, behavioral change will happen almost immediately within a colony. In some cases, a new queen can be chosen. In other cases, once the queen is lost, the colony is lost. And so the response to the presence of queen pheromone is somewhat normalizing, we might say, but there's a whole suite of behaviors that occur often with the loss of a queen that can then lead to a successive queen being chosen. Now, getting into topics related to defense, people often think of ants as these warriors, these fighters, always getting out there being very aggressive. And I will say that this is certainly the case with many ants. They have a lot to defend, and they can be aggressive, both in attacking prey, but also in just defending their resources. It is not true across the board. Now, you can see this beautiful soldier, this major from an army ant with those massive jaws and those recurved mandibles that could be especially painful. In fact, it's the same species, as you can see. I have this photograph in my office. That aggressive nature pertains to many species that hunt for a living and also have some sort of exposure. So for example, army ants that don't have a very well protected colony in their temporary bivouacs, they need to be defensive. On the other hand, there are many other ants that are not aggressive. They defend the nest, in fact, by being more passive. Cephalotes ants, the turtle ants that are found in the neotropics, are an excellent example of this. Look at those heads. They use their heads almost like manhole covers, like stopping up a sewer. They fill the hole. They find these holes made often by bark beetles that are exactly the right size. And the majors will have a more round and a larger head than the workers. So there are some strategies that these ants will use to prevent anybody from getting into the colony. Blocking the entrance hole is one of them. Playing dead is another. There are many ants that when attacked, so Atta and Acromyrmex, the leafcutter ants, and many of the other leafcutters as well, they do a very good job of just holding completely still or even falling when they're threatened. These behaviors, these passive behaviors, are very different from what we think of when we think of aggressive ants, but they seem to do a very good job of keeping these ants alive and also keeping threats away from their colonies. Now, there are other approaches to defending the nest, and some colonies, of course, can't keep hidden, especially if they have large nests. So for example, these thatch mound ants, these Formica ants that are found in Europe and in North America, they use their chemical defenses, not only to deter predators, to sort of get them away using formic acid, but they also use a series of alarm pheromones to alert others in the colony so that they can have a very quick and strong response. Now, they can't sting, but they can certainly bother by biting and being very aggressive towards any kind of intruders. Here's a great example of a bunch of Azteca ants defending their tree against an intruder. So this is a Camponotus that has been captured and really spread-eagled, trapped by all of these ants. Now, these ants are not going to kill her. What they're doing is they're actually pulling her legs far away and they're dragging her to the edge where they can then drop her off of the tree. She is being soundly rejected from being on this tree. So this is not an attack where they're trying to eat her. It is simply an ejection of an intruder on their territory. This is only possible, of course, because there's such a massive workforce there, many, many, many Azteca and only one big Camponotus. But you can see that in this case, size doesn't win. It's in strength in numbers. So one of the things that we can do with ants, even though we don't necessarily know everything that ants do, we have so many mysteries yet to understand, but we can start to piece together a little bit about what ants do by actually looking at them physically. So one of the places that we often look to try to understand a little bit about the biology of ants, if we don't know much about them, is to take a look at their mandibles. So I love looking at these photos. These are ant web photos, and I've picked a selection of just different mandible types so you can see how variable they are. Now, just like we might look at some mammals and see different eye sizes or ear sizes and be able to interpret a little bit about whether they're predators or whether they are prey, whether they really focus on visual acuity or whether they have to have good hearing, we can see a little bit about what these ants might do because of their giant mandibles. Now, I mentioned that some ants are grinders. If they're granivores, they have these big mandibles and big muscles controlling those mandibles. You can probably look across these ants and see which one of these is most likely to be a granivore, grinding up that grain. On the other hand, you might also be able to guess which of these are predators based on the number of teeth and how much their jaws look like they're made for capturing other insects. And some might leave you guessing because you might notice that they have long mandibles, but they don't have a lot of teeth there. So what are they doing instead? Well, this is something that I would like to talk a little bit about as we get into some of the different lifestyles of ants. So here, just as a handful of different ants to show off, we can see some of these behaviors that we know belong to particular genera or even just some species. We know a little bit about what they do, but we could certainly learn a lot more. I'll point your attention to the bottom left, just to say that with these trapjaw ants, we are starting to get a really great understanding of how they work in terms of being hunters. So they open their jaws wide. They have trigger hairs in the center. If a prey item touches those trigger hairs, it triggers this mechanical response where those mandibles slam together, capturing a prey item. Now, knowing what we do know about these big trap giants, you could take a look at the figure in the center. This mini trap giant, or Stramigenes is the genus, they have a similar approach. Now, there's quite a lot of diversity in mandibles amongst these tiny little 1 to 2 millimeter long ants that are springtail specialists. Now, how quickly they can snap their jaws varies amongst different species, and what type of springtails they go after, and whether they're sit and wait predators or whether they're actually out hunting varies quite a lot. But starting to understand this mechanism and actually how the head shape and the muscles in the head really affect this ability of the mandibles to either move quickly or to be very strong, because there is a trade-off there. This is something that a lot of researchers are starting to understand by combining biomechanics with studies of morphology and also looking at the evolutionary history of these groups. Now, for any of these other groups that I have on this slide, you can imagine studying either the behavior or the biomechanics of how do they do what they do. There's certainly a lot out there that we don't yet know about many species, but what we do know is just intriguing. So one of the things about ants that's really remarkable is that not only are the ants themselves incredible, but they have these relationships with other organisms that just cannot seem, we cannot seem to get enough of. So I won't spend too much time on fungus growing ants because we've talked about them a little bit, but this basic idea that it's not simply the ants growing fungus. This is of course mediated by the plants that they have to collect in order to provide a substrate for the fungus to grow on. But there's also this microbial component where there are weeds, you can call them weeds in the crop that they grow, which is the fungus. And then the ants might even have some bacterial, we might call them herbicides or fungicides. So pest control within the ant colonies. So it's quite a dynamic system and certainly more complex than it appears on the surface. The same is true in terms of the complexity when we talk about hemipteran honeydew producing insects. So there are many ants that have relationships with honeydew producing insects. Some of them are quite casual. They will tend many different types of insects, but there are many that are actually very, very specific. So if you look on the bottom right, there's one example we know of where these ants, Melissa tarsus, really rare and very actually strange ants, they have the ability not just to rear these insects and take honeydew from them, but they actually farm them for meat. So in some way, they're more like herders rather than just dairy farmers, actually feeding on the hemipterans as well. Strange and wonderful. Now, there's one example that we know of, this Melissa tarsus. The question might be, are there other examples? Are there other ants that do this that we just don't know about? I won't say yes or no at this point, but I'd love to know. Once we know it exists, the desire to explore more certainly arises. And because ants are, of course, living on and around plants, it makes total sense that there are many plants that have taken advantage of the benefits that ants can provide, both in terms of defense of the plant, but also other sorts of benefits that ants can provide, such as some sort of fertilization to the plant and some other services. So defense against herbivores is one of the most common ways we see ants benefiting plants. And the plants, in turn, are attracting the ants by providing some sort of shelter or food. So, for example, in the neotropics, you'll see these giant cecropia trees, these emergent trees in the forest, and they have these hollow stems. Now, it's a wonderful and interesting story because when a cecropia tree is young, it's nice and tender, and you can have a queen ant burrow her way into one of those initial cavities. Now, as if she's a mated queen, of course, she'll become physogastric and she'll start producing eggs. And so she will grow too large to come out of that hole that she initially made. So she will be essentially trapped in that little chamber for the rest of her life. If all goes well, of course, she will have a huge colony occupying that tree alongside her, and those chambers will be filled with brood and with other workers. And that connection between the tree and that colony will last until the death of one or the other. But there are a number of other plants that do interesting things as well. So many ant plants provide shelter for ants just by having some sort of hollow structure on the inside. So Myrmicodia and Hydnophytum are these epiphytic plants that can be found basically in usually high in trees, hanging on trees, and not just ants, other organisms might also live in there, but they are not the only ones that can actually house ants. Some plants provide stems or thorns or some sort of other tubers in which ants can live. And that attraction for the plant is that the ants will then bring resources in the form of any sort of refuse, which can usually provide some nitrogen. Now, ants are also attracted not just by shelter, but by food. And so we see not just floral structures, but extrafloral nectaries, which are often little cups filled with nectar that really are targeted to attract ants. And then things like these little Belchian bodies, which are part of leaf structures, which include proteins and fats. There's a wonderful story that I don't think we have time for today, but it turns out that it's not just a free gift for the ants saying, thank you for helping protect this tree. Those bodies actually, in some ways, entrap the ants to staying connected to the tree because there are some enzymes in those food bodies. So not just providing the nutrition, but they also cancel out the ants' ability to produce some of the enzymes that they need to digest sugars. So the ants are really in some ways entrapped by the tree into staying there. And that way they are good defenders because they can't go off and pick another tree. So myrmecophiles are a particular love of mine. And if you have spent any time really exploring ants, you've certainly encountered the world of other organisms that interact with ants and hang around ant nests. Now, just to give you a short description of some of the diversity of myrmecophiles that might be out there, there are beetles, flies, crickets, wasps. There are even mollusks. I found snails that are associated with ants, silverfish, bristletails, mites, butterflies. It's just a wonderful world of critters that are associated with ants. Now, what is it about the ants that's so attractive to these ant lovers, these myrmecophiles? Well, if you think about what they have to offer, and I'm just going to come back to this in a second, any of these other organisms that might be inquilines or live in association with an ant colony have the benefit of both food, shelter, and defense. So if they can crack that chemical code, if they can get past those soldiers defending the gates of the ant colony, if they can be inside, then they can take advantage of the riches that are in there. And one of the ways we know that ant colonies are just such wonderful places to live is that we see evolutionarily a huge amount of pressure for organisms to adapt to getting past the ant colony and living within the ant colony, either undetected or minimally detected. This came from a wonderful paper by Joe Parker a few years ago in Myrmecological News, in which he explored myrmecophily in beetles. And this figure shows just some of the forms that beetles take that live in ant colonies. Now, what are all of these weird shapes about? Well, some of them are about defending them. If some of them look like they're little tanks, it's defending themselves against attack by ants when ants discover them so they can survive. In other cases, they actually start to resemble ants, and all of them have wonderful chemical glands full of chemicals that they use to, in some ways, bewitch the ants. They're tricking them. They're starting to speak their language. And in some cases, they might be eating the brood. In other cases, they might be eating the resources that the ants bring in. But in many cases, they're also just taking advantage of the shelter and the protection that the ant colony affords them. So a great example of this is army ants, of course, because army ants are these tough defenders. They, very few organisms would actually go out and attack an ant colony. So if you can be within that protected structure, you have this wonderful advantage. On the other hand, if you're trying to live with army ants, then you have to do a lot of traveling. They go out and raid in swarms, they come back to their temporary nests, and then they move nests quite often. Now, this appears to be a great situation for myrmecophiles because just studying a single species, Esoton burchelli, in the neotropics, people have discovered over 300 species of other organisms that associate with army ants. Now, I find it especially fascinating that there's this whole world of ant birds, ants that depend exclusively on army ants. They follow them around day to day, follow the colonies, and if they lose their ant colonies, then they are in danger of starvation in just a couple of days. So this is a very tight connection between these. Wonderful stories of how important ants are. Now, inquilines do some weird things, and we still don't have a full understanding of what they do. You might have heard of some of these mites that take the place of the last tarsal segment in the ant's feet. There are also some beetles that do strange things. Here's an example of a beetle that clamps onto the space between the petiole and the postpetiole of this ant. What is it doing? Well, somebody here has written this funny little comic saying that, oh, it's just for looking cool. Looks like you have 2 abdomens here. We don't know much about what's going on. Now, observing that these interesting cases exist is one thing, but really understanding the biology is another. And I guess this is part of the talk that I'm hoping to tell you about today, is that we are just scratching the surface. It would be so great to know more about the biology of the organisms, the ants themselves, and also how they affect others around them. Not just the biology, but the ecology, the life history. These are amazing evolutionary stories, and we don't quite understand what's going on in a lot of them. Okay, moving on quickly now, because I want to wrap up in time for questions. There are, of course, parasites, whether they're fungal, bacterial, or parasitoids, for example, ant decapitating flies. I'm sure you've heard of zombie ants, these ants that have been affected by cordyceps or ophiocordyceps. That fungal infection affects the body, and the ant changes its behavior, goes out, climbs up, grabs onto a leaf, and then the fungal growth proliferates throughout the body, eventually having a fungal bloom in the back of the head. And then there's this killing zone where all the spores fall down. And hopefully for the fungus, other ants would pick up this fungus, get infected, and carry on the infection cycle. Fascinating and horrifying at the same time. But truly, ants' worst enemies are actually other ants. Now, there are many ant species that are specialized on ant hunting. And so this, to me, is one of the most fascinating areas of understanding ants. There's so much that they do that we understand, but once we start really thinking like an ant, we can see that there are lots of strategies for being ants. So many ants will steal juveniles from the nests of other species in order for them to perform the work of the colony. And I'll just walk through a couple of examples here quickly. So inquilines, we've just talked about all kinds of organisms that live inside the nests of other ants. Well, here's an example of that now. The one on the left is a Trachymyrmex species. The one on the right here is Megalomyrmex, and that's an inquiline that basically hangs out in the colony and takes advantage of the benefits of the colony. Now, a more extreme case is temporary social parasitism, where there are some species that can't actually start a colony on their own. So they will actually attack the queen, kill the queen, and then use that colony, that structure, and those initial workers to start a colony of their own. This happens locally here with a couple of our Dorymyrmex species, but it's not so uncommon. Once that new colony gets started and that first batch of workers has expired, it will be just a full colony of the sort of hostile takeover queen. So that's temporary social parasitism. The next one, slave makers, are facultative slave makers, where they do this hostile takeover and then they continue to supply their labor force by stealing workers from other colonies. And finally, there are these obligate slave makers that have a labor force that is entirely supplied by pupae that are raided from other colonies. Now, at some point, I asked you to take a look at some different mandible types, and I'll ask you to do the same here. You can see that this slave maker, this Polyergus species, has curved mandibles with no teeth, and that's because they're not attacking, really. They're using them to carry pupae that they've raided back to their nest, which will then become the labor supply, the labor force for doing all the work of the colony, raising brood, or taking care of the workers, excavating, finding food, things of that sort. So with that, I'll just bring it back to the fact that we've just touched the surface of how much ant diversity there is out there around the world. And if some of these stories get you excited and make you think about, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful to learn more about these? I encourage you to keep looking. There are many, many stories that we could learn much more about. And I just encourage you, go out and meet your neighbors. They are fascinating organisms. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And thank you for your attention. I'd be very happy to spend some time answering questions if there are any. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. It was nice and informative talk. So now the session is open for discussions. Anyone who have doubts, please raise your hands. Gautam will promote you to the panelist. You can ask directly. So there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box.
Okay. So would you like me to read the questions from the Q&A box?
I will read.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So one question from Rian Sadish. What are some ways to deal with the problems of invasive species? Are there methods in place to curb their populations?
Great question. I think this is going to be one of the major questions that we deal with over the next generation, really. So what we know about invasive species is that once they're well established and widespread, there is very little hope of eradicating invasive species. And so our best efforts really are made at preventing establishment. And so talking to people in places where invasive species control is extremely important, such as islands that can be very heavily affected, making sure that new species aren't introduced is where a lot of energy and effort goes. So looking at Australia or New Zealand, or even places that are smaller but really have a lot to protect. Hawaii is a good example where there's quite strong quarantine and inspection, preventing new species from being introduced. How possible that is around the world in other places is really a question. It is definitely introduced species are being introduced by people, and increases in trade are associated with increases in population pressure or propagule pressure of new invasive species. So I think one of the things that we can do, rather than just throwing up our hands and saying these invasive species are going to be getting around, is I do actually think that inspections and training people to recognize and identify some of the worst invasive species, the ones we know we should be worried about, is one of the most effective things we can do. Because if there is a small established population and it's recognized early on, then that can be treated and managed with some combination of chemical and physical control, actually getting rid of the ants. But past a certain point, then it's just management and try to mitigate some of the problems. So one of the things that I'm involved in is trying to help provide resources, both identification resources and then training opportunities for people who work, for example, at ports of entry. So thanks for your question, Ryan. It's a question that occupies my mind a lot. And I know there are a lot of people around the world who are really concerned about this.
Yeah. Another question. I have seen ants and tree hoppers share in the same tree or habitat and have found it very fascinating. Is this behavior a mutualistic behavior wherein the tree hoppers help ants with the plant sap and the ants protect these tree hoppers and their nymphs?
Yes. So this is one of these really wonderful mutualistic relationships that we often see where the ants are getting the benefit of nutrition because the plant hoppers actually are producing some honeydew, and ants definitely are defending them. I love these relationships. I love seeing how they play out in different taxa. I mentioned aphids, but also scales, hoppers of all sorts do attract ants, and the ants do get this nutritional benefit. Depending on the ant species, some ants can be very dominant, and other ants in some cases will be less dominant and a little bit more opportunistic. But these interspecies interactions, they're sort of a general way that they play out. And then you also see some species specific differences. So I know that that there are people who've worked on particular species and really understood the dynamics between, the hoppers in one species of ant versus another. I think more of that research would really help us understand some of the dynamics at play. There's a fine line between a mutualism and a little bit of exploitation. And just as I mentioned that in cases of trees that attract ants, but also try to entrap them into continuing to be defenders of that tree, I think there's a similar dynamic, can be a similar dynamic at play with a lot of the sapsuckers as well. So that's something that I would love to see more research on. Interesting topic. Thank you for your question.
Yeah. So one more question, Nature Club Vicer Kolkata. Just a simple question, why do ants bite us?
Yeah, this is such a great question. I get this question all the time. What are you doing? Why are you biting me? So ants bite to defend. And a lot of the time, what's happening is that we have inadvertently disturbed them. We've gotten into their space. So for example, if they're in your house or you're outside and suddenly you find this ant either biting or stinging you, you might think, I have done nothing to disturb this ant colony, but perhaps you were in a place where this ant was walking around and you are perceived as a threat. And if this is a species of ant that has a very low threshold for being aggressive, then maybe the first reaction is to sting. So red imported fire ants are very common throughout the southern United States, and people here have gotten very used to just getting stung by these ants for very little provocation. They have a very low threshold for being aggressive. There are some other ants, and those are found on the ground. They tend to be sort of crawling up your pant legs, and then suddenly you find yourself with, if you're wearing sandals, getting stung. There's some other ants that are arboreal, and they periodically fall down from the trees. And one of the things that'll happen is maybe they'll get trapped inside your collar. And all it takes is a little bit of pressure, maybe the squeeze of your shirt against your skin, and the ant will perceive that as a threat, that it's being attacked. And so that's when they sting. So, their behaviors are logical. They're not out to get us, but we often don't know that we're in their space. And so that's often when it happens. Thanks for your question.
Next, fascinating, engaging stories. Can you please talk a little bit more about ant mandibles and their feeding habits? As in, what can I guess by looking at ant's mandible about its feeding habit or some other behavior?
Thank you for this. This is something that I love. It's a little bit of a, how do we understand what this animal does just by looking at it? So I think I mentioned a couple of these already. One is that these mandibles that have lots of teeth, a little bit like baskets. You can imagine they're capturing something and holding it close to them. So there are a lot of ants that will do this in a way that sort of they're going out and they're catching something, they're eating it. Whereas you have these long, I'm going to turn sideways for now, these trap jaw type ants, where this long jaw allows them to reach out way in front of them. So these are a little bit of stealth predators. You can tell if they have really long mandibles like that, they're probably stalking their prey, and they're maybe moving slowly. They have to get close enough for the trigger hairs to touch so that they can then slam those jaws on them, but they're essentially sneaking up, and those long jaws give them a chance to stay farther away and not scare away their prey. Now, smaller mandibles, lots of ants have to do things with their mandibles. It's not just about feeding. They also have to take care of their brood. They have to excavate their nests. And so you might see sort of what we would consider sort of a normal, somewhat triangular mandible with some little teeth on the edge. This is a sort of a typical look for multitasking, I would say. But then you see some variations, which is that, for example, leaf cutters on the very edge of that mandible, they have very sharp teeth, and they're also extremely high density. There was a paper that came out this year, and I think there's some mineralization of the edge of the mandible. And that's because those workers actually have to cut the leaves. And the silica that's in the leaves, of course, is very abrasive. And so they have to be able to do that for their lifetimes and, not lose the teeth on their mandibles. So looking at the dentition on the mandible, the shape of the mandible, and then also at the head of the ant. And this is one of my favorite things because it's very revealing. When you start looking at ant heads, the mandibles, of course, are connected by muscles. And if you need to have very, very strong muscles controlling your mandibles, let's say you have a fast strike or you have to hold something very strongly, then the muscles don't fit just in a normal kind of round head. And so what you'll see is the back of the head becomes sort of heart-shaped and bulging. And that's to house these big muscles that then attach and control those jaws. So whenever you see an ant that has a big heart-shaped, bulgy back of the head, that means that something very strong is happening with those mandibles. A lot of control needs to happen there. Thank you for your question. This is wonderful stuff.
Okay, next one. Thank you, Dr. Andrea Leckie, for the wonderful presentation. Have you made any observation on the impact of climate crisis on ants?
Oh, so this is very much like the invasive species question. It's not a matter of, what can we do to solve the problem? It's how are we seeing the problem unfold, and what will we have to continue to do to protect diversity? So yes, there are certainly papers that are showing that ants are affected both at very high elevations. So imagine that you have ants that are living at at the highest point that they can on a little mountain somewhere. As temperature rises, the ants have nowhere else to go. And so they may be, climate change may actually make their special habitat, their little ecological zone disappear. But something similar is also happening at low elevations because there may be limited ability for ants to tolerate different temperatures. So if you're already living at very hot temperatures and temperature goes up, there may be less flexibility. Ants at low temperatures, this is interesting, ants that have adapted to living at low temperatures, so in temperate zones, actually tend to have quite larger tolerances. So the range is that they can tolerate lower temperatures and higher temperatures because they have to deal with a seasonal environment. On the other hand, ants in tropical places or very hot places, they tend to have less tolerance of temperatures going down, but also of going up even higher. They might be really at the limit of their range to tolerate heat. And so there have been some really interesting studies looking at the question of how is climate change going to affect ants in places like high and low, and also how this will decouple ants from the places where they live. So let's say that they only live in a certain type of tree, they might live in a certain kind of zone and a certain sort of habitat. If the host plants are lost, for example, or if the host insects they associate with are lost, then that can have this secondary effect on the ants. So what can we do about it? I guess I'm part of this generation, as you are, trying to understand what can we do? And I think for me, conservation is a huge part of what we need to do. So understanding the biodiversity, providing data in terms of species lists, or at least biodiversity counts, so that we can see that some places really are worth protecting, creating larger areas that are protected so that we don't lose these ants. And hopefully biggish areas will allow biodiversity to persist in some intact form, even hopefully to withstand some of the changes that are coming our way because of climate. Thank you for your question. I hope you come up with some solutions too. We certainly need a generation of people thinking about this and working on it towards solutions.
So next one, is there any specific reason why adult ants only ingest liquid material, and why don't larvae feed with same liquid material?
Good question. I wish I knew more about this, but I have not done a whole lot of internal anatomy of ant work. And so what I do know is that there's this really interesting structure called the Proventriculus. And so it's sort of like a muscular structure that kind of blocks a lot of things from coming in. So if you imagine that the way the gut goes, something comes in order for it to pass all the way through to the mid and the hind gut, it would have to get past this sort of gateway, which is very narrow. Now, if the Proventriculus only lets a tiny little bit through, that is the reason that adult ants can only ingest liquid. Why that doesn't develop yet in larvae, or why it might be sort of more open or allow other items to pass through in larvae, I don't really know. But the other factor, and I'd love it if somebody knew more about this and they could correct me, is that of course the adult ants, they're not really chewing. So we think about these big mandibles. If we try to think about our own mandibles, we think about them as jaws for chewing. For ants, adult ants, their mandibles are often for manipulating. So they're picking things up, they're carrying things around. Maybe they're bringing them to the mouth, but the mouth is just an oral cavity. So in larvae, there's more of an ability to actually chew, masticate the food. And maybe that's one of the ways that larvae can actually ingest things that adult ants wouldn't be able to. Not my area of expertise, but it's a great question, and I'd love to know the answer if anybody's a larval specialist out there.
Andrea, I think in Trophallaxis also, when they are transferring liquid material, it contains a lot of growth factors also.
Yeah, that's true. There's a lot more than just nutrition that's being passed back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Next one, ma'am, you told about Dracula ants. So do they always drink their pupa or larvae, or only in scarcity of food they drink them?
Okay, so this is such a great question. And again, this group is not my area of expertise, but my understanding is that this is what the adults eat. That they might be able to ingest some other, maybe just pure liquids, but for anything, for the large part, the adults are actually piercing the bodies of the larvae, and there are particular places on the body where they pierce them, so they're not just cutting them open, and it's not actually damaging to the larvae, but they have actually adapted to the larvae have adapted to being fed on by the adults. It is such a wonderful and strange developmental and sort of colony structure that, yeah, I should know more. Thank you for asking that question. I should go find out more. You too. There are great papers on it out there. So if you look up Dracula ants, I hope you can find out some more information. As I've said, I'm just scratching the surface here. So to answer your question directly, I think it's not about scarcity. I think that this is their regular way of feeding.
Yeah. Next one. How ants select a new queen if queen died because of any reason? Workers will select which larvae for that?
Thank you for asking this question, because this is possibly one of the areas that I think we are learning so much more about ants and how they function, that we used to have an idea of what we might call a typical ant colony. One queen, whole bunch of workers. When the queen dies, the colony is done. So this is how it is for many ant colonies, including things like leaf cutters. But it turns out that that is not the most common or the typical one. It's the one that we've studied the most. So depending on the kind of ants you're looking at, you can get really different systems. In some cases, you have multiple queens and they're present in the nest. And if a queen dies, there are many others and production just keeps happening. In some cases, you'll have these fighting situations where there's kind of a tournament of new queens that will have to fight amongst themselves. One of my favorites actually is an ant in India. And I wonder if anybody knows this ant. I won't say the name, and maybe someone can tell me about it. They have a situation in which in a normal situation, when there is a queen, when the pupae emerge, the workers will actually help them get out of their pupal cases. And then one of the things they do is they have these little glandular structures where the wing buds would be if it were a queen. And the workers actually excise them. They get rid of that little glandular structure there. And that makes them incapable of being reproductive. Now, in the absence of a queen, what happens is that instead of those little structures, those gemmae being cut off, the pupae that are emerge and they have those structures. So they are potentially reproductive. Now, those individuals will have to fight amongst one another, and the strongest one will win, will become queen of the colony, and then the others will either be killed or have their gemmae excised. Does anybody know what ants those are? I'm just curious how much you folks know about ants. Actually, I'm going to ask you to step in here. You must know.
I think dicama.
That's right, dicama.
Yeah.
One of the most beautiful ants, but also one of the most interesting in terms of their behavior and their reproductive biology.
Yes. Yeah.
So people have used the term mutilation, but I think that's not quite right. It's really about, in some ways, chemical control and control of development of the reproductive structures within the body of the adult.
Yes. Okay, shall we go to the next question?
Yes, let's move on.
Yeah. Can you name few of the 18 species which depend exclusively on army ants for their survival?
Oh, okay. Let's see. So there are, I don't think I said 18. I think I said that we know of at least 300 species that are associated with army ants. And of the birds, the ant birds, there are a number of them that depend on ants for their survival. But it's unfortunate, I am not a bird person. There is somebody here I know at the University of Florida who's actually studying the relationship of who's a bird person who I'm working with now, who studies the relationships of these ant birds to the ants in terms of how dependent they actually are, tracking them, seeing how many colonies they follow at any one time. And if he were here, he would be able to give you the bird names. But yeah, this is not an area that I know very well. I simply know that I can tell you a little bit about how they function. So what happens with these birds is that because the ants are spending a good part of their life cycle actually being nomadic, they move every day. So the birds in the morning, first thing, we'll check in on the place where the army ants had bivouacked or sort of holed up the night before. And then throughout the day, the ants will check on the trails where they're foraging. And when the army ants scare up other invertebrates, so they're basically flushing insects from the undergrowth, those birds are able to feed on the animals that are being scared away. So whether a grasshopper or spider, things are moving in the undergrowth, the birds really depend on that kind of flushing in order to get enough food. So throughout the day, they'll be checking on them. And then last thing before dark, they'll have their last round of checking to make sure that they know exactly where that colony is. Now, it sounds very straightforward, but they may have 2 or 3 or 4 colonies that they're tracking at any one point in time. So you can imagine a situation, for example, when they lose track of one, the colony either goes into a very tangled place where it's hard to see where the colony is, and then maybe there will be rain for a couple of days. And so the birds won't necessarily be able to follow exactly where they are because they're not out foraging. So if this happens for a long enough period of time, the birds won't be able to forage on their own and get enough nutrition. And if they have lost track of, let's say, all of their colonies, or if there simply aren't enough colonies in that area for them to go out and get enough food throughout the day, and in just a matter of days, they would run out of energy. They wouldn't be able to feed themselves and they would die. So although I can't give you names, the general term is called ant birds, and it's not one particular lineage. It's actually quite a diversity of different birds from different lineages that have become specialists on following army ant colonies. I hope that answers your question. Thank you for the question.
Impact of climate change on ant diversity, relation between season and diversity of ant species.
Okay. These are, let's see, a lot of questions there.
Yeah.
I'll start with the relation between season and diversity of ant species. So, I mean, I think seasonality is maybe the question. So if you're in an environment that's tropical where there's less seasonality, do you have higher diversity? If that's the question, then yes, we do see that, that tropical places tend to have more ants than temperate places. So what's interesting is that it's not just wet temperate or wet tropical. So you also see places that are very dry. For example, the American Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, northern Mexico. So these desert environments have quite a lot of ants, just really amazing diversity. But a huge amount of those lifestyles have to do with going underground. And so one of the things I think we might end up seeing as a real impact of climate change is that ants that have some sort of behavior and life history that where they're already dealing with difficult, stressful climatic situations. So for example, desert situations in which the ants have to provision themselves, if you will. So I'm thinking of, for example, honeypot ants. They spend a lot of their lives underground with underground stores. And so this might be one of the ways that ants can buffer against changing climate, maybe for some period of time. Maybe they have limited resources, but they're good at storing the resources. The ants that will possibly be most affected, are going to be ants that have a little bit more of a temporary and tenuous existence. Maybe they don't have places where they can shelter from higher temperatures or shelter from extreme temperatures or extreme climate conditions. So higher drought, lower temperatures, these climate extremes that we're seeing now. So when we're seeing extremes going on either side, the ants that are not used to withstanding those extremes of either temperature or rain or drought might be the ones most affected. So what does this mean? You know, ants associated with caves might do fine. Ants associated with living underground might do better. But the ones that have very temporary shelters or live on the surface of the leaf litter, or even worse, who live in the canopy and are very exposed, might be very affected. I'm just speculating here, but I think that these are the kind of questions that a lot of people are asking right now. And it would be really wonderful to start seeing some research where people are trying to make predictions and then study different communities to try to understand what we can see as being the most either vulnerable or threatened ecological types of ants. And one thing I will say is that there is some work being done on fossil ants and fossil ant communities, which is quite interesting right now because people are looking at ant communities based on what they find in amber and trying to understand in terms of their abundance at different periods of time, how they might have been affected, how ecologically they might have kind of fit together as a community, and try to draw some lessons for what we can expect to see happening to ant communities today and going into the future. Thank you for your question.
Next one. If one wants to start exploring the fascinating world of ants, what would be your advice? Any certain set of protocol which one must follow? Most importantly, how to identify the species?
Thank you for asking that, because that's probably a question a lot of people would like to know. One of the things that I would say is the most important thing to do is start where you can. So if you live somewhere, you are probably not very far from ants, unless you're in a very, very cold place. So outside, whether you're in a city or in a more rural area, there are ants around. And I would say start looking for the information you can use to identify ants. There are a couple of websites that I will recommend. So AntWeb and AntWiki have a lot of information about ants of different regions of the world. And even if you're in a place where the checklists of ants may not be totally complete, you can certainly use the different keys that are available publicly, just free and publicly, to get to genus. So both of those sites are valuable for looking at pictures. AntWiki is especially good at drawing from the literature and compiling together keys for identification for different regions of the world. So learning the genera of different ants, I think, is really helpful, because then you know if in your region you might be able to see whether you have 2 species, 3 species, or 300 in that genus. If you can start drilling down, and maybe you don't know a name for it, but if you can identify, okay, this is a genus in which I have at least 3 different species, that's the place I would start. Sometimes it's not so much the name that matters as being able to identify differences amongst species. If you have a local university or a museum, so museums often have great resources. If there's a museum with specimens that you can compare with, or if there's somebody who's done some identifications who can help you, that's great. But I do think that there are also some resources online. For example, on Facebook, I know there are a few groups of people who study ants. So I think there's one just called Myrmecologists. And I think there must be others. I'm not too active on Facebook, but I do know also that on Twitter, if anybody's on Twitter, there's a wonderful community of people who work on ants. And anytime somebody jumps on Twitter and says, hi, I'm interested in ants and I'm in this region, is there anyone I could be in touch with to help with identifications? Or are there any resources for identifications? That's a really nice, very active community of people who are willing to provide direction or give some encouragement. One thing that I see happening a lot right now is that there are groups of people who are raising ants as pets. And I just think it's so wonderful. So people making their own ant farms, and it's not really ant farm, but habitats, formicaria, where they can really observe life history and understand, how these ants function, feed them. And again, communities have arisen on social media so that people can communicate about how best to take care of them. And I think as scientists, we are also learning a ton about these ants from people who do this kind of work. I have a PhD student in my lab right now who's been very involved in ant keeping since he was young. And one of the things that we're trying to do is figure out how do we connect to people who really just love ants, but don't have the opportunity to study science at a university. So this is one of the things that I do think is a wonderful resource for people who are studying as hobbies, connecting to the actual science. I think we have a lot to learn from people who are taking this interest and learning a lot on their own so that we can connect the information. Good luck. I hope you have a chance to get out and start seeing the ants just outside your door, and then just read as much as you can.
There are many questions here, so I think we'll take 2 more questions.
Okay.
Then others can send a mail to Andrea, and you can later answer those questions, because we already closed our time.
Okay.
So next one, what do you think about the interaction between ants and mealybugs? Do they really help to spread the mealybugs?
So I think you might be asking this question in terms of an agricultural context. Are the ants helping spread these pests around? And the answer I give you might not be very satisfying, but I think the answer is it depends. It depends on the species of ant and also on the species of mealybug, because there are some species that have very close associations with their hemipteran mutualists, where they literally pick them up and carry them around. So a new queen will basically take a hemipteran with her and start her new colony and start her new farm. But in a lot of cases, we do see that ants protect mealybugs. I don't know if in all of these cases they're spreading mealybugs. I was working with a master's student recently and a faculty member who also studies ants, and then another one who studies hemipteran pests. So this is a mealybug project, and we were asking just that question about one species of ant and one species of mealybug. And we did not come up with a clear answer. It was not totally clear that the ants were spreading the mealybugs, but it was also not clear whether the mealybugs were just moving on their own. So I know that in the literature that I've read, there's some suggestion that this is possible and happening in some cases, but not all. So I would say it depends on the situation. Thank you for your question.
Last one is ant anywhere involved in soil formation?
Yes. Oh my gosh, great question. Yeah, so this is such a good point. We often think about ants as, what they do on the surface, and then we think of them as going into their colonies underground and just kind of, living their lives as if they were sitting in their living room at home and, just being passive. But ants are necessarily changing, really engineering the ground under our feet, because ants are so ubiquitous. Anytime they go underground, what they're doing is they're actually mixing these soil layers. And even if they don't go, hundreds of meters deep, let's just say they go 1 meter deep or 2 meters deep, what's happening is that they're really pulling up nutrients and different minerals and churning the soil. That picture that I showed of these atta, these large leafcutter ants that are in Paraguay, when you look at the scale of the landscape, this just gives us a sense, okay, these are very dense and they cover huge areas and they're huge underground. Think about that much soil being moved around, and also all this material from the surface being brought down in the form of food or some materials that might be brought into the nest. So absolutely, where there are ants, they are actively involved in soil formation and providing nutrients to the surface from below. So yes, another service that ants provide to us that we often don't recognize them for. So thank you, great question.
Okay, thanks, Andrea.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I see that there are some more questions. One thing I would ask, rather than sending them in emails, is do you think you could collect the chat questions that I haven't answered yet and then send them to me, and I'd be happy to answer them all, and then you can share them with participants?
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to have to go now because I have a class to go teach, but
okay, yeah, sure.
Thank you again for your kind attention and for the wonderful invitation. I've really enjoyed being with you here today.
Yes.
And enjoy the rest of the Myrmecarnival.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you all.